All right, next up is Alex at What Page Are You On? The YouTube channel What Page Are You On? Asks a few different questions. What's a book you think everyone should consider reading? I would say everyone should consider reading at least one Toni Morrison book, either The Bluest Eye, probably, or Beloved, though my personal favorite is The Song of Solomon. I would say everyone, especially in America, should read Toni Morrison. Are there any books you think you would have liked better if having read it earlier? That's a good question. I think about that a lot with books that are much more focused on plot. When I was younger, I needed a book with a very tight and very exciting plot. And I really don't like plot-centric books anymore. So whenever I read a book like that, I often think about how much I would have liked it in the past. Oh, a good example, actually. Actually, I have it right here. Is of another book that I know I would have loved if I read it earlier. I read it last year, The Northwater by Ian McQuire. And the reason why I would have liked this if I read it earlier is because this book is so derivative of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian that it's insane. It's a good book, but the first sentence is behold the man, which just sounds like see the child. But that's a book actually that I read last year, and I think I would have loved it if it didn't seem like he was writing a fan fiction of Blood Meridian. Alex also asks, do you have a favorite bookstore? I would say my favorite bookstore in the world, when I was living in the UK, I was living in the city of York, kind of up in the north. There's a bookstore right next to the York Minster, the cathedral, called York Minster Bookstore. And I loved that bookstore. I'd go there all the time when I lived there. It's like 5 stories, and each story is only like one room. But they would just have this collection of modern literature, of like academic works. I remember I found a grammar of the Gothic language in there from like 1922 for like £2. It was awesome. And it has just great views out the window of the Minster. I would say that's probably my favorite bookstore that I've ever been to and that I've frequented. He also asks, would you say your taste in other storytelling mediums, for example, movies, is the same as your taste in books? I would say it's pretty close, and it's becoming closer the older I get. I think I'm more lenient with movies, though. I think I can deal with a dumb movie. I shouldn't say dumb. I can deal with a kind of entertaining movie in a way that I can't really do with books. If I'm reading a book and I don't like it, I just put it down. Whereas a movie, I can usually get through. He also asks, if your life were a novel, which author could you imagine writing it? That's a good question. That's one I actually had to think about a little bit, because my life is, I'd say, pretty boring. Not in like a bad way necessarily, but just in kind of it's more mundane. And so I think that the best author for that would be John Williams, who wrote Stoner, because he's able to write, at least in Stoner, this life that is quiet and mundane and ordinary, but he's able to make it so enthralling and so interesting. Stoner in that book, if you don't know, kind of has this like wandering lifestyle where he seems like he's never fully in control of his life. He's always kind of just wandering through his life until he finds academics. And that kind of gives him a purpose. And I feel like I've had a pretty similar trajectory to Stoner, minus all like the sexism that Stoner expresses. But I feel like I have kind of that similar trajectory in that I've kind of found solace in literature. So either John Williams or maybe even Halldór Laxness, because I think Halldór Laxness is able to do a similar thing by taking the mundane, ordinary, and blowing it up to make it extraordinary. And he also infuses it with this quirky, strange humor that I kind of admire a lot. So yeah, I would say John Williams or Halldór Laxness. I'd be very honored if we could revive either of them and have them write a book about me. All right, next, Fraser Simons at the channel Springboard Thought asks, what movie was the most offensive to you in terms of medieval accuracy? That's a great question. And this is one that I unfortunately don't really have the best answer to because I don't actually watch that many movies that take place in a medieval setting. I really don't like most medieval movies. Not for any like specific reason, but more in that it feels like work when I watch it. I feel like I have to like do the work of a historian. But I like medieval movies that try to capture the tone or the worldview of the texts that they're drawing from, rather than try to be like actually accurate. For instance, I think The Green Knight with Dev Patel is a fantastic movie because it captures the ominous tone and that kind of worldview of the poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Whereas something like the movie Braveheart tried way too hard to portray itself as if it was being like a gritty historical movie, and it's just so historically inaccurate. And Braveheart's actually one that might be most offensive to me because when I was living in York, I had a bunch of American friends who kept asking me to look out for William Wallace, because in the movie William Wallace sacks the city of York, but he didn't historically. So that one is kind of that was the most annoying. I would say in terms of actually being offended, I get pretty offended, I think, every time someone in a medieval movie draws a sword and you get the swing. I don't know why people in Hollywood make scabbards out of metal. And just a couple other things that always bother me. Tattoos on Vikings or on Nordic, medieval Nordic people always kind of bothers me. Not because I have anything against tattoos, nor do I have any evidence that they weren't tattooed, but we also have no evidence that they were tattooed. So just the idea that you can't even make like a Viking movie nowadays without them having tattoos. If people saw that, they would go, wait, they're Vikings, they're supposed to have tattoos. That kind of annoys me because there's no evidence to suggest that they were tattooed, except for one source that isn't very credible. And yeah, I haven't seen any of the Beowulf movies, and I don't plan to. So yeah, I don't really have the perfect answer for this. I'm sure most medieval movies would annoy me and offend me if I actually watched them. All right, Eric Carl Anderson, of the channel, Eric Carl Anderson, asked a couple different questions. Why do you think the majority of Americans are disinclined to read literature in translation? That's a really good question. That's a really big problem that I encounter all the time. Even in like the academic world, I find that so many people, even in the English department that I'm in, don't read translated literature. And I think there's two main reasons for this. I think one is that Americans fully believe, subconsciously or not, in American exceptionalism, in the trajectory of Western civilization. That Western civilization, you know, the course of history of the West has began in Mesopotamia, went down to Egypt, over to Anatolia, to Greece, to Italy, then Western Europe, and then across the Atlantic to America. So we, Americans, are the product of all this history. So why would we go back and read anything that isn't American, right? Surely it's lesser if we're the product. So I sincerely think that most people do, either subconsciously or not, believe in that myth. But I think the second part to this is that is instilled on us, right? I'm doing graduate work in an English department. None of the sources that I study are in English, or at least in what we would call modern English, but it's an English department. It really should be called the Language and Literature department. But yeah, so I think that also plays a giant role in this. That when you're in high school, you take English courses. You don't take literature courses. You take English courses, and I think that forms a subconscious bias in all of our minds. Though I do think that the bias isn't just subconscious. I think it's also pretty conscious a lot of the time. He also asks, what's a country you'd like to visit after reading about it in a book? And have you ever visited a different country after reading about it in a book? So the first one, what's a country you'd like to visit after reading about it in a book? I mean, I've never actually been to Norway. I've read a ton of Norwegian literature. I'm studying the language. I'd really like to go to Norway. Also, Greenland sounds really interesting. I've read a few books that take place in Greenland. And also Hungary. I read a lot of Hungarian literature. And I know almost nothing about that country's history or anything. Or their culture, really. So I would say Hungary is also a place I'd really like to go, because they produce some really good literature. And the second part to this question, he asked, have you ever visited a different country after reading about it in a book? And I would say the best example of this for me is when I went to Iceland for the first time. After having read the Icelandic sagas for years before, I went to Iceland the first time for a week with my sister, actually. And then I went a year later with my then girlfriend, my wife. And both of those times, I just dragged them around to different saga sites, these different places that I've been reading about forever, and you can just go to. And because it's Iceland, they were just like hills or waterfalls or whatever, right? It's not like you were going to Paris and going to see, these massive buildings and grand architecture. I would just drag my wife across a glacier so I could go look at a rock that is referenced in Eyrbyggja saga or something like that. That was a lot of fun, though. And the last question he asks is, what texts do you reference the most in your teaching? And I would assume you mean in my literature courses, because I teach kind of literature courses, and I also teach like composition courses in just writing. But in literature courses, because I often teach kind of introduction to literature courses, what I usually try to do is have about half the semester be medieval literature, and then the other half be contemporary literature, and we try to bridge that gap. But every single time I've taught that class, I always teach a different version of that class. But every single time we start with Beowulf, and Beowulf kind of sets the tone for the class. So I would say Beowulf is the one I refer to most, because that's kind of, it forms the bedrock of a lot of our classes. All right, the next question is from Garrett Jenkins on YouTube. What is your reading habit routine throughout the week or day? I try to read every single day. This is something that I'm not sure if other people experience, but if I don't read during a day, I feel like intellectually incapacitated. Like I feel like I can't articulate my thoughts as well. I feel like I can't think properly, which sounds like I'm being hyperbolic, but I'm really not. So what I tried to do is every single morning, I read first thing in the morning for at least a half hour. Again, if I spend that half hour watching YouTube videos or something like that, I feel very different throughout the day. So I try to read every single morning, and then I do work stuff all day. I run in the middle of the day. Usually mid-afternoon, I take like an hour break, and I go for a long run, and I listen to an audiobook on that run. And then after work, I read at night. So yeah, I try to get in anywhere between, usually at minimum, an hour of reading, and then also like an hour of listening to an audiobook. And then at maximum, probably on a weekday, probably, I don't know, 3 hours of reading or so. But yeah, I try to just read every single day, because if I don't, I really don't feel well. Noah Blacker asks a couple different questions. The first one is, what do you look for in what you want to read? Without trying to sound too pretentious, one thing that I really look for in books is books that are difficult. If I read a book and I finish it and I think I've understood the book, I realize that I just read a really bad book. If I understand a book entirely, that book wasn't very good. I like books that are challenging, books that either are challenging thematically or structurally or linguistically. I like books that challenge me because they then stick with me as I keep trying to figure them out for days after. Again, if I read a book that I understand, I put it down and go, all right, that was great. And then I don't think about it anymore. A challenging book really makes me continue to think about it. And those are the kind of books that, for me, have a more lasting experience. They're the books that stick with me for the longest time. Maidenhair is a great example of this. I forgot to put this back, but that I read recently. That it was challenging in content, in form, in all of these different things. Those are the kind of books that I really, really love. And then he also asks, what's a book that emotionally impacted you? I can think of two examples off the top of my head without even thinking about it that much. One is Tarjei Vesaas's The Birds. That book broke me last, I think, July when I read it, or last June. And then another one that really hurt, that really touched me emotionally last year was when I read Tadeusz Borowski's This Way for the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen. It was a Saturday. I remember so distinctly. It was a Saturday. I got up to make a cup of tea, and I put water on the kettle. And then I don't know why, but I sat down on the ground in the kitchen and just kept reading the stories. And I sat on the ground in the kitchen for about 3 hours as I just read through all of those stories. And those hit like a brick. Those were brutal. Also say, recently The Trees was quite emotional, and books by Daša Drndić. For some reason, both those authors use this, they use like a list of names at different points in their texts. And whenever I come across a giant list of names in that Percival Everett book, The Trees, or in Daša Drndić's work, that really hits me because of how personalized it is. Just trying to recapture a name. But yeah, unfortunately, I really don't get too emotional when reading that often, which is something that I wish I did get more emotional. But it's just not really in my nature to do that, with a few exceptions. All right, Speed Racer asks, where did you go for university and what did you study? I went to university, trying to be kind of vague here, but I did my bachelor's at a relatively small, relatively not very good, public state school, public state university here in the States. I did my bachelor's there, and I majored, I think they asked what I majored in. I majored in history and English, and I did my master's at another school in the UK, where I went and lived for a year. And there I did a master's in medieval studies. And then now I'm at another university in the United States in an English department, doing a PhD, in an English department, but I'm doing medieval literature and language and history. Then he also asks, do you read in any foreign languages? I can read in a lot of dead languages. I feel very comfortable with Old English, Middle English, and Old Norse. And then I've studied for at least a year, and I feel moderately comfortable with Old French, Old Occitan, Latin, and I think that's it. And then for modern languages, I can read French pretty well. I had to show competency in reading French for my degree. I can kind of read some Spanish, but not really. And then Icelandic and Norwegian I'm working on. I can read some modern Icelandic just by way of Old Norse, but Norwegian is something I'm actively working on right now because I really want to be able to read those languages. And then he also asks, are you familiar with the Brazilian author Machado de Assis? And yes, I am. I read, it was translated as The Epitaph of a Small Winter in the version that I read a few years ago, but the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas. I actually just got a new translation, the new translation to English that came out, I think, last year. It was actually just sent to me by a publisher. So I actually really want to reread that because when I read it the first time, I didn't like it that much, and I know that was on me and not on the book. So I actually plan on rereading that one pretty soon because I'm quite interested in that. I always hear really good things about Machado de Assis. Tiago Ribeiro asks a very difficult question. He says, I have one question. Do you have any schedule for reading sessions outside your academic work? How can you do both? As an academic myself, I know it can be hard, and right now I'm having trouble with that. And if I'm not able to read for pleasure, everything else starts to look gray and I can get very depressed. Yeah, I feel the exact same way, as I spoke about just a bit earlier. I would say when I was doing my master's and the first part of my PhD, I couldn't read for fun. I had no time, as much as I wanted to. I listened to audiobooks at that time because, again, I would run and exercise and stuff. But yeah, especially the first, say, 2 years of my PhD, I didn't have time. Now I have kind of forced myself to take my academic work as a normal job, or as normal as you can get. So what I try to do is try to maintain regular working hours, where I usually work from usually about 7:30 to about 4:30 or 5 at night. And then the times after that, I try to just clock out and read for pleasure, read for fun. I try to read my own stuff then. And then also on the weekends, I'll usually work like a half day on either Saturday or Sunday, but then I try to take the rest of the weekend off. Again, during my master's and during the first few years of my PhD, this was not possible. And I was very, very unhappy. I remember the first few years, up until I passed my comprehensive oral exams, it was, 12 to 14 hours a day, and then all day on the weekends. And me and my wife, she was also in graduate school at the time, we would just, every single weekend, we would work from, well, 7 in the morning until 5 or 6 at night. And it was awful. So yeah, it's not really a balance that I have fully figured out yet, because it's not really a balance that is fully possible. There are times during my graduate work that you just have to fully focus on that and not think about anything else. And I would say up until I passed my comprehensive exams, it was just that. That was all you could do. That was all you had the brain space for. I remember there was a period, and it was like one of the only times in the past decade, where there was a period of like 3 months right before my comprehensive exams that I didn't read a single other book. So yeah, it's not a balance I have fully figured out. I will say, if you're able to, try to treat graduate work or academic work or whatever as a job. You can only get in so many hours. And for me, this has actually been increasingly relevant, as I find that after I've worked, I don't know, say 9 hours, maybe 10 hours in a day, the rest of the work after that is so bad that it's not even worth doing. I usually have to just revise everything I wrote after that anyways. So yeah, it's something that I'm probably not the best person to give advice for, because I haven't fully figured it out. So yeah, try to set time aside for yourself to do it, because your happiness does matter more than the graduate work that you're doing, I promise. But yeah, I'm still working on it. All right, now we're moving over to Instagram, where we have a few different questions. Olivromefisgou. I know there's like names in there and I can't parse them right now. I apologize for mispronouncing your name. But they ask, where do you live? I live vaguely somewhere near New York City, or in New York City, who knows? George Salis over at the Kaleidoscope asks the classic questions: what's your desert island book, album, and movie? This is one I actually had to think about a little bit, because this is something that I don't know if you guys get this, but I get asked a lot what my favorite book is, from students or just other people, and I never have a good answer, and I don't know why I haven't just sat down and just like come up with a stock answer for questions like this. But so we'll go through these. Desert Island book. If you get rid of the classics like the Bible or Shakespeare or whatever, I would probably pick either John Milton's Paradise Lost. That's a poem that I just absolutely adore. And I feel like it would keep you company because you could perform it out loud. And I feel like the orality of that poem is just gorgeous. But another good one is Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla. This is a really big work from the Middle Ages. It's over 800 pages in the modern edition. And it's basically just a history of the kings of Norway. But it goes through 200 years, 300 years of history. And it's just full of all of these stories of all of these different kings. And so there are, these like kind of very long, massive narratives, but then there are so many small set pieces within it that I think you could get absolutely lost in this for a long time and really see all the connections between these small stories. It's, it reads like a history book in a lot of ways, but Snorri Sturluson is the guy who wrote the prose Edda, and he also probably wrote one of the most famous sagas of the Icelanders, Ale Saga. So it is very literary in quality. And I think that, without sounding like an idiot who's picking a medieval book to bring on an island, I think this would actually be a pretty good book to have with you. I think it would keep you entertained for a long, long time. And then for an album, Björk's Vespertine. I think that would probably be my favorite album. Just a beautiful, beautiful album. And then for a movie, I would have to pick The Lord of the Rings. If I could only pick one, it would have to be The Fellowship of the Ring, but it would have to be the extended edition, of course. All right, JiayuanC on Instagram asks, is there a country or language whose authors you are excited to explore more of that you haven't gotten to yet? There are so many. Every time I think about this question, I realize how dumb and how not well read I really am. It happens all the time. I'll just think about Poland and think about how few Polish writers I've read. I would say a really big gap that I'm really interested in filling at some point is Chinese literature. I feel like I haven't read almost any Chinese literature, and that's something that I would really like to get to. I have a few books by Ken Shui. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I apologize. that I really want to read because it sounds so interesting, but it seems like something that I should be more well-read in. But I've never really gotten around to it. So I think that's a pretty good answer. But you could pick pretty much any country on the planet, and I would be much more interested in reading more of their literature than I have already. Right, the Spinecrackers Podcast, which is a fantastic podcast, and they have a great YouTube channel as well that I highly recommend checking out. They ask, what are your views on literary theory? Should good literature speak for itself, or does the variety of available interpretive frameworks increase our overall understanding and appreciation of literature? This is a really good question, and one that, because I am primarily a medievalist, academically, medievalists have a tendency to ignore a lot of literary theory for whatever reason. I mean, the main reason is that to really approach a lot of medieval literature, you have to have a really firm understanding of medieval history, medieval archaeology, art history, medieval theology, philosophy, language. So a lot of that, you spend a lot of your time doing all of those things rather than doing like literary theory like you would if you were specializing in, I don't know, 20th century American literature. So medievalists tend to not do that much literary theory. And I'm no exception. Literary theory for me isn't something that I'm particularly interested in. I've had to read quite a bit of it because, again, I ended up in an English department rather than like a medieval studies department. But it's not something that I'm that interested in. I think what I'm more interested in a lot of the time is like sociology and sociological theories rather than literary theories. And for some reason, I'm always much more interested in sociology than psychology. I feel like a lot of literary theories is much more interested in psychology. But if I had to like explain which kind of literary school I'm in, I would probably be somewhere in the new historicist school, which again doesn't really use that much literary theory because we have to use so much history. So yeah, I'm much more interested in like historicism for the most part. But yeah, great question. I think literary theory was kind of beaten out of me in grad school because I was always in classes with a bunch of people who would focus more on like modern literature, and they would find it very useful, but it wasn't super useful for me. So I've always kind of shunned it. But that's a personal failing on my part rather than on the value of literary theory more generally, I think. Satanick Mukhuty asks, I'm curious how you manage to read so many books. Is this also your full-time profession? No, it's not really my full-time profession, though I do feel a professional and also ethical obligation to be well-read. I don't think that everyone needs to be well-read. Like, I don't think if you're, I don't know, like a plumber or an electrician, I don't think you necessarily need to be well-read. I don't think it's like an inherent human virtue. But I do think that if you are a teacher, if you're in academia, if you're working with young students, I think you do owe it to them to be as well-read as you can possibly be. And so for the longest time, I have felt that, and maybe I've just convinced myself of this because I enjoy reading so much and I've convinced myself that it's worthwhile, but I do feel an obligation to be well-read. So I do view reading in my spare time as almost a part of my job. Some of my favorite professors when I was doing my bachelor's were experts in certain fields, but that field didn't confine them. They were able to branch out. I remember I had one professor who was a medievalist, and he was very good at being a medievalist, but because so many of the students in the class had no frame of reference for medieval literature, they would bring in, they would start asking questions about how this relates to, I don't know, like Jane Austen or Virginia Woolf or something like that. And because he was so well read and he knew Jane Austen and Virginia Woolf and all these other people, he was able to build these bridges between what we were studying in medieval literature to all of these modern authors. And I found that to be so pedagogically effective that I tried to force myself to be able to do that as well. Because there's nothing worse than being in a class and losing sight of the forest for the trees, right? Of only being able to focus on the literature that you're focusing on and then losing sight of why it actually matters. So yeah, in some ways I do view reading as a part of my job. But no, it's not a part of my job. And the way I read so many books is because I sincerely view it as like a moral necessity on my part to read more books. It's just as simple as that. I need to read. If I don't read, I don't feel good about myself. And so, yeah. Also, audiobooks. If you're looking to read more, get into audiobooks. Okay, Reader.Drinker on Instagram asks the very difficult question, should art be separated from the artist? This is a difficult question, primarily because you need a case-by-case basis to answer this question. There are some people there are some authors for whom exceptions exist. But I will say that my primary thought on this is that no, you can't separate the art from the artist. And the main reason for this isn't because of some like moral judging or something like that. It's primarily due to the fact that the artist usually hasn't been able to separate their ideologies from their art. That is, if someone, an author, is abusive to women, or they are racist, or something like that, obviously on a moral and a political level, I abhor those people. But the main problem for me is that then means that in their art, their depiction of women or people of color, in both of those two instances, are probably pretty bad. So how could you separate those two? So yeah, the thing that I am more concerned with often isn't whether a person is a good person or a bad person. It's that their actions, their bad actions, are often predicated on some ideology, some bias that I disagree with. So it's not that I don't read their work because they did this one bad thing. They did this one bad thing because they have this ideology that that allowed them to do that. And so how is that ideology going to be separated from their art that they also create? It's not going to be. At least in literature. I think it is easier in different artistic fields, of course. And I mean, I think the obvious caveats need to be said, that I do think it's easier with dead authors because we live in a consumerist capitalistic world. When you buy a book, you are supporting people. So I do find it easier to separate art from artists with dead authors rather than contemporary alive authors. But I mean, I don't think you can just fully separate them. I talked about this a little bit in my video on Knut Hamsun. I did a review of The Growth of the Soil. The problem with his work isn't that he became a Nazi later in life. It's that the reason he became a Nazi later in life, and some of the stuff that he writes about in Growth of the Soil, are based in these nationalistic, racial, exceptionalist tendencies. So both of those things are based in the same ideology. So it's not that I can't separate art from artists, it's that the artist can't separate their ideology from their own art. And note, this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to then ignore that artist. I still read Knut Hamsun, but I don't think you need to fully separate them. And I don't think you can fully separate them. But yeah, this is a difficult question because there's so many different answers for so many different authors and works and stuff like that. And hopefully I didn't get myself into too much trouble with that answer. But it's a good question. It's one that I think we need to constantly be thinking about because, again, it changes case by case. All right, we've come to our final questions. These are from Ulisses Brandao over on Instagram. And he asks a few different questions that I'll go through quickly. The first question is, the best book you will never recommend to anyone and why? I think recently, Peter Nadash's Parallel Stories is a good example of this. I'm very, or at least I try to be pretty careful in those videos to not actually recommend it to someone because I don't know if other people should read that book. Though I think it was an amazing experience. Another good example of this, I think, would be Karl Ove Knausgaard's My Struggle. I try not to recommend that to anyone because, well, I think it's kind of rude to recommend a book that's over like 700 pages to someone, let alone a book that's 3,600 pages. But I adore Karl Ove Knausgaard's My Struggle, but I wouldn't recommend that to just anyone. He also asks, what are your soundtracks to reading? I talked about this a little bit earlier, but I do like a lot of like neoclassical music, especially a lot of stuff that comes out of Iceland. They have a lot of like really good neoclassical artists. But I do listen to music when I read, and I often try to find like a video game soundtrack or a movie soundtrack or a neoclassical artist that pairs well with the book. So I try to find things that thematically match. But I've been listening to recently a lot of Magnus Johan, Olafur Arnolds, Vikingur Olafsson, Philip Glass, artists like that. And then he asks, 3 books you want to see adapted to movies, and by which directors? This is one that I had to think about quite a bit, because I don't watch that many movies, and I'm not like really big into film, but I think I have some good answers. The first one is I want to see, and this should come as no surprise, but the Icelandic sagas are an absolute goldmine for Hollywood that I don't understand why no one has picked up adapting Njál saga or Gisli saga into a Hollywood movie. It would work so perfectly. So my first answer would be either Martin Scorsese, kind of like Gangs of New York style, or Paul Thomas Anderson, kind of There Will Be Blood style, to adapt an Icelandic saga for the big screen. And if I had to pick an Icelandic saga, it'd probably be Gisli saga, though Njál saga would work well. I mean, there are so many scenes in both of those sagas that are so cinematic that would just be, they would be insane movies. Another one would be, I really like Guillermo del Toro, and I think he could do a really cool movie based on Yuri Herrera's Signs Preceding the End of the World. That book has a lot of like mythological, well, the structure of that book is based on a journey to the underworld, to the Aztec underworld. But it's also obviously about immigration from Mexico to the U.S. But I think Guillermo del Toro is able to often like move between realism and fantasy in ways that I think that book would be great for him to make into a movie. He could also do a lot of, I think, Schoen's books, because they also kind of move between these kind of mythological, fairy tale-esque worlds and these very realist worlds. I think so. Either him doing Science Preceding the End of the World, or perhaps like The Blue Fox by Schoen or something like that. And then another one, and this, I don't know how good of a movie this would be, but I think it'd be awesome, would be the Hungarian director Béla Tarr doing Jón Kalman Stefansson's Heaven and Hell. I want just an 8-hour movie, you know, Shatantango style, of just this fishing village in the West Fjords in Iceland, just going about their daily lives. I think that would be an awesome, dreary, depressing, but beautiful movie. And then I'm going to add a fourth one, just because I thought of it. But I really like the movies by the Safdie brothers, like Uncut Gems, what's the other movie? Good Times, or something like that. I think they could do a really cool adaptation in that kind of chaotic, anxiety-inducing chaos of movies with Tom Christensen's Havoc, the Danish novel from, I think, like the 1920s. That's like one of my favorite books of all time. But I think that they could really capture the chaos of that book, the havoc of that book, in some really interesting ways. So I think that'd be a good one as well. And then the last question that he asks is, which contemporary author or books do you consider canonical? Now, I will have to say, I don't really care too much about the canon. I'm not too big on creating canons. I more like kind of deconstructing canons, because I think a canon is only as worthwhile as the time in which it's being used. The canon is a tool, and therefore it needs to adapt. But the problem is that a canon is also by nature unadaptable, right? It needs to be set in stone. So I think there's kind of an inherent contradiction in the idea of a canon. But I mean, if I had to pick like one author that is without question canonical moving forward, and who's still alive today, it'd definitely be Cormac McCarthy. I think his books are just absolutely wonderful. I think Blood Meridian is probably my favorite book of the last 50 years. So, yeah. All right, that's all the questions that we have for now. Thank you. Thank you once again for all your questions. Again, it's crazy to think that there are people watching these videos, let alone people who have questions about me or about my opinions on certain things. It's very bizarre and strange to think about that. But thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for all the questions. And here's to another 1,000.